The hydraulic shear stopped against 40 tons of steel, and the demolition operator climbed down to find himself standing in front of a bank vault that had been sealed since the spring of 1933. The job, until that moment, had been routine. In 2023, a demolition crew on the west side of downtown Detroit had pulled up to a 4-story commercial building that had been sitting empty since the 1970s. The structure was one of dozens scheduled for removal that week under the city's blight-removal program, a 12-year campaign that had already cleared more than 27,000 abandoned buildings from Detroit's neighborhoods. The contract called for the building to be down to its foundation by the end of the month. An excavator with a hydraulic shear took the upper floors apart in a single afternoon. The brick and timber came down in clean sections. The roof collapsed inward as designed. And then, on the second day, the operator pushed the shear into the rear wall of the ground floor, and the machine stopped moving. What it had hit was not minor. Behind the plaster and the rotted lath was a wall of steel-reinforced concrete more than a foot thick. The shear could not bite through it. The operator climbed down to look. What he was standing in front of was the side of a bank vault. The door, when the crew finally found it after another day of careful demolition, was nearly 3.5 feet thick. It weighed an estimated 40 tons. The dial on its face had not been turned since before the Second World War. The building above it had been many things in its life: a print shop, a wholesale grocer, a furniture showroom. But the vault belonged to none of them. It belonged to a bank that had gone out of existence in the spring of 1933, and the vault had been sealed when the bank failed, and nobody had opened it since. The city's demolition office called in a historic preservation consultant. The contractor's schedule was suspended. Under Michigan procedure, structures of unexpected historical character cannot simply be hauled off in trucks. The vault, sitting in the middle of a lot otherwise reduced to brick rubble, had to be documented before it could be cut apart. It took a team of specialists 3 weeks to open it. To understand what the crew had stumbled into, it helps to step back 4 years before the vault was sealed, into the months when the building above it had still been a working bank branch. The vault dated to 1929. That year, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed on October the 24th, and again, more devastatingly, on October the 29th. The entire American banking system began the slow process of failing in waves. Detroit was, in that moment, the 4th largest city in the United States. It was the center of the global automobile industry. Its skyline was being rewritten at speed. The Guardian Building had opened that April as the headquarters of the Union Trust Company, a 40-acre interior of Pewabic and Rookwood tile and Art Deco metalwork that contemporaries nicknamed the Cathedral of Finance. The Union Trust Group, soon reorganized as the Union Guardian Trust Company, controlled roughly 40% of Detroit's banking by the time the Guardian opened its doors. Smaller branch vaults of the same group, and of its rival, the Detroit Bankers Company, were scattered across the city in buildings exactly like the one being demolished in 2023. What happened next is one of the most thoroughly documented banking collapses in American history. Between 1930 and February 1933, roughly $250 million was withdrawn from the First National Bank of Detroit alone. By January 1933, the city's largest banks were losing between $2.5 million and $3 million a week. Union Guardian Trust appealed to the Reconstruction Finance Corporation for a federal loan and was told that the loan could only be granted if Henry Ford agreed to subordinate his deposit of $7.5 million with the trust. Ford, then in his early 70s, refused. He went further. In a meeting at his Dearborn office on the morning of February 13th, He told the acting comptroller of the currency, Francis Gloida Walt, and Treasury Secretary Roy Chapin, that he would also withdraw his far larger deposits from the First National Bank if the federal government tried to force the issue. The next day, on Valentine's Day, the governor of Michigan, William Comstock, declared a statewide 8-day bank holiday. 900,000 depositors lost access to roughly $1.5 billion in frozen funds overnight. Within 3 weeks, 37 other states had suspended banking operations, and on March 6th, 2 days after his inauguration, Franklin Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday that closed every bank in the country. The First National Bank of Detroit and the Guardian National Bank of Commerce never reopened. They went into liquidation. In their place, on March the 21st, 1933, the National Bank of Detroit was chartered with $25 million in capital, half from General Motors and half from the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It opened for business on March the 24th in the old First National Bank building. The smaller branches of the failed banks, scattered through the neighborhoods, were boarded up. Their assets were transferred to receivers. Their vaults were locked. And in many cases, the contents of those vaults, the safe deposit boxes, the working currency drawers, the bond ledgers, sat exactly where they had been on the morning of February the 14th, 1933, while the buildings above them were repurposed, sold, abandoned, and eventually scheduled for demolition. Which brings the story back to a hydraulic shear stopping against a concrete wall in 2023. The team that opened the vault worked carefully. The original combination had been lost when the bank went into receivership, and the surviving records were incomplete. A locksmith specializing in pre-war vault hardware was contracted from out of state. The first attempt to drill the lock failed. The second attempt, executed over the course of a single 10-hour day, succeeded. The door swung open on hinges that had not turned in 90 years. Inside, in a room measuring roughly 20 by 25 feet, the team documented the first of what would become a long inventory. The floor was lined with steel safe deposit boxes, 432 of them stacked in tiers from floor to ceiling. Most were locked. A few had been opened by depositors in the days before the closure and never relocked. The boxes that were opened during the documentation contained the small artifacts of interrupted lives, marriage certificates dated 1921, stock certificates for companies that had not existed since the Hoover administration, war bonds from 1918, a single gold pocket watch with an inscription in German, and a sheaf of letters tied with string. None of the safe deposit contents had been publicly itemized in full. Under Michigan abandoned property law, the materials were transferred to the state treasurer's unclaimed property division for cataloging. The second discovery was the working currency. A teller's till on a side table held $147 in small bills and coins. The working float that would have been used on the morning of February 14th had the doors opened. Inside a separate drawer, a stack of larger denomination notes, including several gold certificates of a kind withdrawn from circulation after Roosevelt's executive order of April 1933, was sealed in a manila envelope marked in pencil with a date and a teller's initials. The third discovery was the ledger book. It was a bound volume, roughly the size of an atlas, listing the bank's outstanding loans by name and address as of the close of business on February 11th, 1933. Archivists from the Walter P. Reuther Library at Wayne State University, which holds extensive collections on Detroit's banking history, were brought in to evaluate the document. The ledger names hundreds of Detroit businesses and homeowners, many of them recognizably the small grocers, machinists, dressmakers, and undertakers who lived within walking distance of the branch. The loans were never called in by the failed bank. They passed to the receivers and were, in most cases, settled at a fraction of face value during the long liquidation that followed. The book is, in archival terms, a snapshot of a working-class neighborhood at the exact moment its economy was being severed from the financial system. The fourth discovery was harder to interpret. Stacked against the rear wall of the vault, Behind the safe deposit tiers were 3 wooden crates. They had been nailed shut. When opened, they were found to contain promotional materials, leaflets, deposit passbook covers, calendar blotters, bearing the bank's name and the slogans of a 1928 advertising campaign aimed at recruiting new depositors during the building boom. The crates appear never to have been unpacked. The leaflets are dated for distribution in March of 1929. They were printed, delivered to the branch, and stored in the vault for safekeeping. They were still there 94 years later. The fifth discovery was a single object that the documentation team described in their internal notes as the most affecting item in the entire vault. On a small shelf above the teller's till, in a velvet-lined wooden box, was a child's savings passbook. It belonged to a girl, named in the book in pencil, who had opened her account on her 7th birthday in 1930. The balance was $12.48. The last deposit was dated January 31st, 1933. The bank closed 2 weeks later. What happened to her account, to her money, and to her family in the receivership that followed? The passbook does not say. Archivists have proposed several plausible reconstructions based on the address listed. The exact outcome remains unknown. The sixth discovery was structural. Set into the floor of the vault, beneath a square iron plate, was a smaller subvault, a coin storage well roughly 4 feet deep, used to hold rolled coinage and bullion when the branch carried more cash than the main floor required. It was empty. Records from the receivership confirm that the bullion holdings of the smaller Detroit branches were transferred to federal custody during the bank holiday, in compliance with the gold surrender orders that followed Roosevelt's proclamation of April 1933. What had been in this particular sub-vault on February 11th has not been determined. The transfer ledgers for the branch-level holdings have, according to the archival team, not been located. The seventh and final discovery was the door itself. On the inside face of the vault door, screwed into the steel with brass fittings, was the manufacturer's plate. It identified the door as having been installed by the Mosler Safe Company in 1928. Mosler vaults of that vintage are documented in surviving company catalogs in the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. The door installed in this Detroit branch matched a model that the company had also supplied in the same year to a federal depository in Kentucky. The technology was the same. The era was the same. One door has been a museum piece for decades. The other had been sitting behind a wall of rotted plaster in a building scheduled for the wrecking ball. Detroit's relationship with its own 20th century strata is unusual in American urban history. The city's collapse from a peak population of nearly 1.5 million in 1950 to under 700,000 today has left a vertical archive of abandoned commercial, industrial, and residential structures unmatched in any other American metropolis. The Land Bank Authority alone has overseen the demolition of more than 27,000 buildings since 2014 under a program initially funded by $265 million in federal hardest-hit fund money, and later by a voter-approved $250 million bond known as Proposal N. The total spend on residential blight removal alone has exceeded $500 million. Each demolition cuts through a layer of the city's economic history. The 1933 banking collapse is one of those layers, and not a small one. It was the failure of the Detroit banks, more than any other single regional event, that triggered the nationwide banking holiday and forced the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation under the Banking Act of June 1933. The vault behind the plaster in a forgotten West Side branch is, in that sense, a primary source artifact of the moment when American banking changed permanently. The contents of the vault were removed over 4 days in late 2023. The safe deposit boxes went to the state treasurer. The ledger book and the passbook went to the Reuther Library. The currency, including the gold certificates, went to federal custody pending appraisal. The promotional crates were photographed in place and then transferred to the Detroit Historical Society. The door itself was the harder problem. It weighed 40 tons. It could not be lifted out without dismantling what remained of the surrounding structure, and the cost of preserving it intact was estimated at more than the entire demolition contract. In the end, the door was cut. A torch crew sectioned it into pieces over the course of 2 days. The Mosler manufacturer's plate was removed first and donated to the Detroit Historical Society. The rest of the steel was hauled to a scrapyard south of the city. The concrete shell of the vault was broken up with the same hydraulic shear that had been stopped by it 3 weeks earlier. By the end of the month, the lot was empty. But the building was not the only branch. The Union Guardian Trust Group, the Detroit Bankers Company, and the smaller institutions that failed during the holiday operated dozens of neighborhood branches across the city. In Corktown, in Delray, in Black Bottom before it was cleared for the freeway, and in Poletown before the Cadillac plant took it. Many of those buildings still stand. Many are now vacant. A significant number are on the land bank's pipeline for demolition or sale. The contents of their vaults, if those vaults are still sealed, and if there is no comprehensive survey to say how many are, have not been cataloged. The State Treasurer's Unclaimed Property Division holds approximately $5 billion in assets statewide, from sources that include long-dormant safe deposit boxes, but the office does not publish a building-by-building inventory of which closures contributed which assets. How many sealed vaults from the 1933 collapse remain inside standing structures in Detroit is at present an open question. The Guardian building still stands at 500 Griswold Street. Its main banking hall, the one with the hand-painted canvas ceiling and the Tiffany clock, is now a county office. Commuters pass through it every weekday. The walls are the same walls that held the meetings of February 1933, when Edsel Ford sat as chairman of the Union Guardian Group, and the trust company quietly bled toward its collapse. Down the street, the former First National Bank building, where the National Bank of Detroit opened its doors on March 24, 1933, still carries on its facade the architectural confidence of a financial system that had not yet failed. Above ground, the city is rebuilding. New apartment towers rise along Woodward. The riverfront has been redesigned. The land bank's inventory is below 1,000 homes for the first time in a generation. Below ground, in basements that have not been opened in decades, in vaults behind walls that have been plastered over twice, the paper of an interrupted economy is still sitting on the same shelves where the tellers left it. Ledger books that have not been read, passbooks that have not been balanced, safe deposit boxes whose owners died without telling their children where the key was kept. The demolition crews are moving down the list, block by block, branch by branch, and every so often, the shear stops against something the city had forgotten it built. Thanks for watching. If this is the kind of exploration you want to follow, subscribe. There is more to come.